We said the biophysical and biogeochemical feedbacks cannot always be separated. Similarly, carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle cannot also be separated in ecosystems, whether it's marine ecosystems or terrestrial ecosystems. This is a schematic which illustrates that point pretty well. So we are talking about anthroposphere, which is all human activities like land use change, fossil fuel burning, and industrial nitrogen fixation. The biggest one, of course, is the fertilizer production. These are the perturbations to both carbon and nitrogen cycle. So we have CO2 emissions, reactive nitrogen, and ultraviolet radiation being affected by fossil fuel burning. Industrial nitrogen fixation is basically causing, other than all the increased crop yields and so on, excess fertilizer application typically has resulted in what is called eutrophication. It's a spelling mistake there. Eutrophication is where you have excess nutrients coming into water bodies, which cause phytoplankton blooms, and the zooplankton that graze the phytoplankton do not respond as quickly as phytoplankton do to the nutrient spurts, which means the phytoplankton, which live typically for a few days to, let's say, a week or two, are not consumed, so they die and they sink, and they are respired by the aerobic microbes that rely on this kind of detritus and organic matter, and they use up all the oxygen while eating this buffet of dead phytoplankton raining down. And this loss of oxygen can lead to hypoxia or anoxia, which make other species very difficult to live and can result in fish kill, and shellfish and bottom dwellers that cannot move fast end up dying. So this happens because of waste water release and runoff from agricultural fields or livestock manure, chicken farms, pig farms, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there are additional feedbacks going from the anthropogenic perturbations, obviously warming and acidification of waters, lakes, oceans, etc. Warming can also lead to deoxygenation, so just reduced solubility, which is a huge problem in the ocean in some places, which affects the entire food chain. For example, reactive nitrogen also can result in deoxygenation because of excess nutrients and so on. Carbon dioxide also can affect ultraviolet UV radiation. There is UVR stress of the vegetation and especially crops. So you can see these kind of feedbacks which are not very easy to figure out from data by itself. But even in the models, you hope the processes you are representing are able to find ways to represent these cascades of feedbacks, not direct but indirect, from reactive nitrogen to deoxygenation, and warming to deoxygenation, eutrophication to deoxygenation, and then what deoxygenation does to the food web. For example, in some places like off the coast of Oregon, deoxygenation is leading to dominance of jellyfish, because jellyfish do well in clear waters which have very low production. Okay, so they rely on filtering the water and extracting whatever little pieces of organic matter there is. So overall productivity can go down significantly. Carbon cycle, obviously in the ocean you have the runoff from all these processes from land into the continental zones or around islands that can affect primary production. The sign of this feedback is not always very well understood. They can also affect the carbon to nitrogen ratio. In the ocean, there is something called Redfield ratio, where carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus are found in fairly constant ratios in phytoplankton and also in most waters. So over time, evolution has happened in a way that phytoplankton take up the nutrients in a specific ratio. When they die and the nutrients are reformed, then that ratio also gets imprinted in the waters. So when you are away from the Redfield ratio, which is something like 106 to 16 to 1, of carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus, you have to figure out why those waters are away from Redfield ratio. What are the processes that are driving it away from Redfield? But changing the carbon to nitrogen ratio can have a positive impact on primary production, but it can come with species change. The types of phytoplankton, large versus small, or certain functional types can change. So it's not always necessarily a good thing if you are looking for, let's say, primary production supplying to the fisheries yield and so on. There is processes also involving nitrogen, like nitrogen fixation. Most phytoplankton require fixed nitrogen, which means nitrate, nitrite, ammonium, and so on. But there are some called diazotrophs, for example, like trichodesmium, which can directly take dinitrogen, which is plenty in the atmosphere, which can mix into the water near the surface, and they can convert nitrogen with their special enzymes and so on into usable form of fixed nitrogen, as we say. So they are a big source of bioavailable nitrogen to other species. Okay. The additional point there is when you have nitrate or nitrite, which has oxygen in it, and the waters have less oxygen, like hypoxia, which is a threshold below which many animals cannot live. Anoxia is like the worst part of where basically no species can live. Then there are some bacteria and microbes which have evolved to break the nitrogen in a process called denitrification to produce oxygen for themselves. So this can have an impact on the nitrogen and carbon cycle interactions as well. There are many details. For example, if global warming creates stronger stratification by warming the surface layer and creating a barrier to easily mixing nutrients across the interface, then maybe nitrogen fixers can come in and take over, but that means you are shifting again away from the species which may be important for maintaining certain food webs like the fisheries that you are interested. So you can see many unknown feedbacks here, many negative feedbacks, many positive feedbacks, and so on. But the point is that the anthroposphere is impacting carbon and nitrogen cycles, and they propagate through the system of the terrestrial and marine ecosystems and kind of cascade through the interactions of the carbon and nitrogen cycles. So just imagine this whole chapter as a survey of feedbacks. We are not getting terribly into details of each feedback, but we are raising all of them so that you can dig further into any specific feedback you're interested in related to your research or your interest or whatever. Okay, so looking at a little bit more details of the ocean. Here you have atmosphere with its CO2 at whatever level. Ocean has a constant exchange of CO2 because CO2 is very easily soluble in water, which gives us aqueous CO2, so hydrated CO2 molecule interacting with water to produce carbonic acid. As we saw before, there is a buffering ability in the ocean because the carbonic acid doesn't remain in that form. If it did, you would saturate the waters because you cannot dissolve more and more oxygen into it. But the ocean is able to move carbonic acid into H plus and bicarbonate ions, and then bicarbonate ions into H plus again and carbonate ions. Okay, this is an excellent way of understanding exactly what happens as we keep increasing atmospheric CO2. So if you double the CO2, then what happens? So if you have, let's say, the reference level of CO2, which is, let's say, 1, you have like 280 ppm in the atmosphere. You get carbonic acid of 8 units, 16, 17 of the bicarbonate, and 268 of the carbonate. So what you want to understand is what happens to this distribution of species, chemical species, if you double CO2 in the atmosphere. If you go to 560, you almost double the carbonic acid, but you can see that bicarbonate doesn't go up as much because this reaction is inhibited in that case. Very rapid increase in CO2 is not good for that rate of reaction, and the carbonate ions are in fact used up. So you actually drop in the amount of carbonate ions, which are very critical for calcium carbonate forming shells in the ocean. So this is essentially the crux of acidification. As you increase CO2, you're going to deplete the ocean of carbonate ions and make it a problem for corals and other carbonate shell forming organisms. So the total dissolved inorganic carbon, you can see, doesn't quite double even though you doubled the atmospheric CO2, and the pH goes down. Okay, so that's the acidification of the ocean. And this is an example of how people like Chris Sabine, Dick Feely, Rick Wonenkoff, and so on have calculated, Sarmiento, Nicky Gruber, there are many names in this game, who have calculated the invasion of anthropogenic CO2 into the ocean. Ocean takes up heat, greenhouse gases, and so on, which are, is related to the thermohaline circulation, as we mentioned before, as well as places where the ocean waters are exposed, subsurface waters are exposed to the atmosphere by some processes of pulling up cold water and so on. That's called ventilation. That's where the exchange can happen. So you need to know where the CO2 may be going. So this is looking at this section in the Atlantic and this section in the Pacific, and this is specifically looking at the amount of anthropogenic CO2 in micromoles per kilogram, and you can see the impact of deep water formation here, where the anthropogenic CO2 has gone much deeper in terms of the amount. In the upwelling regions in the deep tropics, not so much, and the Pacific Ocean doesn't have deep water formation, so it's the subtropical gyres where the invasion is happening deeper. And this is the section in the Indian Ocean, which has a southern a subtropical gyre only in the southern ocean, southern part of its domain, because in the north, because of monsoon circulation, we don't have a real subtropical gyre. So these are the critical issues that we need to understand. There are other quantities shown here, like the potential temperature, and the gray lines correspond to potential density contours for the surfaces. So you can see the invasion along these isopycnals, or constant density surfaces, or water masses. That's how oceanographers look at how the ocean circulation is set up. Okay, so this is really an interesting and important aspect of how carbon and nitrogen are related to each other, and how ocean and land are related to each other, in addition to feedbacks within their own ecosystems.